Let's talk about genetics. Genetics is, by definition, the study of inheritance. And inheritance is looking at how traits are passed down from parent to offspring. The father of genetics, or the very first person to document inheritance, was Gregor Mendel. He was a German monk who studied pea plants. He studied how traits were passed on from parent pea plant to offspring pea plant. And he was able to basically build a foundation for the overall study of genetics. And a lot of what he discovered is used and applied today. Speaking of today in modern science, we now know a lot about DNA. And in fact, we know that it is in our DNA in which we find these traits, the code for these traits, and how they are passed down from parent to offspring. And the traits are actually controlled by genes, which are found in the DNA. These are short segments of nitrogenous bases that will code for specific traits. And traits can have diversity, which means that, when we look at a human trait, for example, we could talk about hair color. Well, we know that there are many different types of hair color. There's brown hair, and just with brown hair, you have dark brown hair, light brown hair, there's red hair, there's blonde, and there's a lot of in between. And this diversity means that there will be different versions of the genes that code for hair color, and that is an allele. Alleles are the different versions of those genes. And depending on the trait or the gene will dictate whether or not it is inherited in a specific pattern. And we'll actually talk about those different patterns here in a little bit. But before we move on, I want to just mention that, again, with my example of hair color is a physical trait. And so that would be an organism or the human's phenotype. So when we say that somebody has brown hair, we say that their phenotype is brown hair. However, if we look at that person's DNA and we look at the genes that give that person their brown hair, we would say that we are observing their genotype. So as far as all of the vocab and all of the basics of learning and knowing about genetics, let's get into a little bit more application. We're going to first talk about a very typical inheritance pattern, which is also referred to as complete dominance. Complete dominance means that one allele, so one version of a gene, will be completely dominant over another. And what that means is that the dominant allele will always be the trait that shows up if it might be in combination with a recessive allele. A recessive allele will be a trait that is hidden. The only way to see a recessive allele is if the individual only has recessive. And so how do we use all of this? Well, we use Punnett squares to basically predict chances of inheritance. And we can use Punnett squares to look at either one gene or we can look at multiple genes. In this particular presentation, we'll just talk about monohybrids or a one-gene Punnett square. And I'll briefly introduce you to dihybrids or a two-gene Punnett square. So let's move on to a specific example of a monohybrid cross using complete dominance. Now I have here two pictures of some rabbits. I have a long-eared rabbit and I have a short-eared rabbit. Rabbit ears are going to either be long or short. Long ears is dominant over short ears. And when we talk about the alleles for a particular trait, we use letters to designate whether we're talking about one version or another. And so in the case of complete dominance, we will use a capital letter for the dominant trait or the dominant allele and a lowercase letter for the recessive allele. So let's use an actual example to kind of show you how this works. If we cross a male rabbit with a homozygous long ears, So this rabbit has two alleles that are the same, and we say it's big E, with a female rabbit that is heterozygous, long ears, meaning the female rabbit has a mixture of alleles. She is big E, little e. I have a pointer right here that shows how we set this up. So big E and big E over here for the male rabbit, and for the female rabbit, big E, little e down here. And so we create this cross, this four square table. And this is what our Punnett square is. Now, if I take this big E, where my pointer is, and I bring it down to the first block, it represents this one right here. And if I take the big E from the female and bring it over to this first block, I get right here this second big E. And so this represents that there is a possibility that through this cross, a big E can be created. And so I do this the same way for the rest of my letters. I just bring the E down, and you can see there's the big E. Bring this little e over, and here's a little e. Again, I have a big E here, and I bring it down, giving me this first one. I bring it down, and I get this. And then I use the big E from the female, and I bring it over. And then for this little e, I bring this over. And so the result of this particular Punnett square is as shown. How do we interpret that? Well, when we look at it, we count the number of squares for the particular trait that we want to look at, and we just kind of put that over the total number of squares, because the squares represent possibilities. So if I wanted to know what are the chances that these rabbits will have offspring that are homozygous dominant for long years, I would say 1, 2, and there are 4 total squares, so 2 over 4, which if you turn that into a percent is 50%, gives me the possibility of having a homozygous dominant long-eared rabbit, or big E. And then I'm going to do the same for a heterozygous dominant long-eared rabbit, and that would be these results down here. And so we have big E, little e, we have 2 over 4, which would also be 50% heterozygous dominant for long years. So let's look a little bit at a little bit more complex example. We're going to look at a dihybrid example. And with the dihybrid example, we're just looking at 2 genes. So we're going to consider long ears in rabbits or short ears in rabbits, but we're also going to look at the size of the rabbit. So those are our 2 traits. So ear size and overall body size. So in my example, I say long-eared rabbits, long ears is dominant over short ears. I also state that large size is dominant over small size. So let's say we cross a heterozygous large, long-eared rabbit. So heterozygous, long-eared, and for large, right here, we'll use S to represent the size of the rabbit, with a homozygous recessive, small, short-eared rabbit. So short ears and small size. Well, setting up the Punnett square is similar to the previous example. However, there's a slight difference. We have to think about the possible combinations of E's and S's. And so to figure out my top row up here, what I do is I take and I use the idea of distribution to set this up. So this big E could combine with that big S, which gives me the first column. But this big E could also combine with this little s and be passed on to a generation. So that gives me my second column. This little e could possibly combine with a big S, giving me my third column. And then finally, this little e could, in fact, combine with this little s, giving me my last column. And so that's how I came up with this. This is all possible. This is all looking at probability. And then I do the same for my homozygous recessive. But this is a little bit easier because they are all going to be the same possibilities. And just like the other Punnett square, you just really bring everything down or bring everything across. And you just want to make sure that it's written with E's together and S's together. And then finally, to calculate your results, we know that there are 16 squares in this Punnett square. So we just count the number and then we put it over 16. So if I want to know what the chances of having a large, long-eared rabbit, I'm just going to count and look at, okay, in order for the rabbit to be long-eared, it has to have a big E. In order for the rabbit to be large, it has to have a big S. And so when I look for that combination, it's only really found in this first column, and that's 4 over 16. If I turn that into a percent, it's 25%. And then the same is true for the other possible combinations.